To reflect on the conversations that have happened before us. One of the things that really touched me was the conversation that was happening in the beginning of Charcha when four young children were speaking to Rukmini and Vishal, and we saw the pain that these children have gone through, dislocated from their schools, dislocated from their livelihoods, having lost family members, having lost a sense of mooring with the outside world that they were so familiar with. But what also gave us hope was these children were extremely optimistic about their life and their hopes of achieving their dreams. Today, we have with us a group of extremely learned education leaders who can guide us a little bit on how we navigate the way forward. The COVID-19 pandemic has generated an unprecedented global crisis of the kind we have never seen before. If there was one thing we have achieved in the last 20 years, it was access, and now even that is gone. 250 million children have been dislocated from learning for almost 16 months. And almost 40% of children, or maybe even more, have had no access to any form of distance education. So today we're going to chart what is the kind of schooling we want to have when schools do reopen. And today we have with us a very, very interesting group of people. I want to welcome Ashok Kamath, who is currently the chairman of Akshara Foundation, Madhukar Banuri, who is the founder and CEO of Leadership for Equity, Safina Hussain, the founder and executive director of Educate Girls, Sonali Seni, the founder of Soulsar, and my colleague Shavita Sharma Kukreja, who is the co-managing director at Central Square Foundation. Shavita, I wanted to bring you in to kick off this session. Tell us a little bit about what, in your view, are some of the top problems that we face as a system as a whole? And what do you think, not just as a leader representing Central Square Foundation, but also the entire education ecosystem, on how we frame this policy response going forward?
Thanks, Anushrup. Very excited to be here. And this is honestly, like Anushrup said, it's not my point of view. Very proud to present a collective point of view that we've arrived in consultation with partner organizations, eminent leaders in this space, including Ashok, Safina, Sonali, and Madhukar. So full credit to all our partner organizations to come together for the sharing, for the deliberations to arrive at this. I think in summary, what we've realized is that there are three key issues we need to respond to when we think of education from a COVID response lens. First and foremost is the learning loss. And the learning loss is not just from the forgotten learning and the missed learning, but there is also a component of social, emotional, and mental well-being. And we have to realize that this is the extent of problem that we now need to attempt to solve. The second issue is a threat of likely continuous disruptions. We can all debate whether wave 3 is happening, will happen, or already happened, what the extent of that will be. But I think it's high time we all acknowledge and realize there is no going back to the normal of February 2020. And what the newness of this normal will look like, we do not know. And hence, whatever we design has to, in a way, be resilient enough for potential disruptions. Third, of course, is a very important lens of equity, like Anushrup also. While we'd all gotten used to celebrating access to education in India, unfortunately, we've taken some significant back steps in that. Of course, gender has been hit harder. There are certain castes and socioeconomic strata which have struggled. A very visible form of that was the displacement of migrant labor, more child marriages. But the equity question all of a sudden needs much more respect, needs much more problem solving. I'll try and be brief on the 10 recommendations. For everyone's benefit, the report is being released. My colleague will be sharing it on the chat. And I'm sure all partner organizations, including us, will be sharing it on the social media handles. But just very briefly, somewhere we need to give COVID the due respect for the extent of the problem that it has been. And it's gotten so deep that the solution cannot be a band-aid solution unless we structurally address some of the fundamental issues that have now got exposed, right? We knew there were certain inherent weaknesses, a lot of them were being worked on, but certain fundamental shifts now have to be institutionalized. I think the first layer of recommendations that we all collectively came together were to solve for equity when it comes to access, to solve for safety protocols to ensure instruction time can be optimized, and to ensure that when we think of school readiness, the transition from at home digital to no learning in whatever format that might have happened, when the coming back to school needs to address for that integration back into school with focus on social emotional. I think the recommendations 4th, 5th, 6th, which hopefully everyone's seeing on their screen, and this one specifically, I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists, is the need to prioritize foundational learning to ensure that our children are able to learn with understanding, read with understanding, restructuring the curriculum to ensure that we have the time to cover it, right? We cannot go back to the normal of this is what the curriculum is and let's just see how we divide it on learning days. It will have to be prioritized, and also identify the learning level of children and then start instruction. In some ways, the grade in which the child is coming back will not be relevant for whatever happens in the classroom. The next set of recommendations 7 to 10, are specifically on how we engage different stakeholders, from teachers, from our coaches, the academic mentors, and also mobilizing community and parents, whether it's in the shape of volunteers or the enabling role we have actually seen parents and communities play through COVID. And the last point is on decentralizing the decision making. It's harder to make a decision on when, say, a large state like a MP or a UP opens schools. But if there are districts where whether it's infection rate, whether it's vaccination coverage, if those indicators are reassuring, then can that be decentralized? Can the learning solutions or what's being sent to children at home, how mohalla schools are being set up, that will really a big part of solving for this learning crisis. Thanks, Anushrut. Back to you.
Thank you, Shavita, for laying out the roadmap. And I think what struck me was one thing you said, that we can't really apply a band-aid solution. So if it's not a band-aid, then what? So I'm going to move over to our panelists, and I'm going to bring in Safina here. Safina, before I come to you and your work, one of the images, one of the most poignant images of the COVID time that has struck in my head and perhaps in other people's head is a photograph that the late Danish Siddiqui took of a migrant laborer with a child on his shoulder. And this is the image of a large number of children and parents who've lost their livelihood, who've moved back and forth between schools. And as I was watching some of your talks, and I've been reading some of the things you've written, you've been talking about this dislocation from school. And I was hinting at this when I started, is that if there was one victory we've had as a country in the last couple of decades, is that we seem to have solved for access. Now, my question to you is, you've been working on the front lines of access to school even before COVID struck. What are some of your observations on what is the extent of this problem? Because I don't think people are even cognizant of the extent of the dislocation problem. And second, is what do you think are ways and means to solve for it, given the constraints that we have in a system?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, and I'm just really grateful to Central Square Foundation to actually put this report together. And really, so I think what we've really seen is the pandemic has completely upended the access issue, right? So even before the pandemic, I have to say the numbers were still fairly critical. I mean, we still had 4 million girls who were out of school. But like we have seen with other pandemics, like the Ebola pandemic, where the out-of-school girl number tripled, right? This is a situation that's going to get much worse. Our schools haven't opened yet, so we don't know what the extent of that will be. But even in countries where schools have opened, what they're seeing is that even though majority of the kids might be coming back, but there are certain vulnerable groups, like kids who have been dislocated, like girls, especially adolescent girls, are not making it back to school, and the data from other countries is beginning to show that very, very, very clearly. So I think, will our out of school children population double, triple, go up 10 times? We don't really know. But we do know that the vulnerabilities in the system have increased exponentially. And I think it does. So my piece, I think, how do we think about it? I think the simplest way that we can sort of gather around this issue is to say the biggest and the first and the most important success metric of Build Back Better will be that all children come back to school. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. That should be the metric all of us follow, regardless of what we're doing. We're saying sabse pehle, every single child needs to come back to school. And we need to organize and plan around that metric. And the thing is, then you have to break it down because the problem is complex. It's not all children don't look the same. Yes, you've got children who are migrant children, you've got girls who've gotten married, you've got, So first and foremost, I think let's focus on the children that we did have data for, who were in school children. Right, but we've got to break it down saying when the pandemic hit and we went into the lockdown, these kids, let's say one of my kids was in the 3rd grade. When schools open, I need to make sure that child comes back into the 5th grade. Right? So if there were 10 kids in 3rd grade when in March the lockdown happened, we need to make sure that those 10 kids are back in grade 5 right now. So that's just that one layer, right? Where we have to track and track and track. Secondly, then we have to count the new enrollments. And, in usual years, you have to count the new enrollment for class 1. Yahan pe you'll have to do class 1 and class 2. Right? So there's this new information that you need to gather and make sure you find all of those children, plus the children that may have entered the village. We are finding lots of villages in Rajasthan where the migrants have come back. And even if they're going to travel for work, their kids are staying. So you've got to identify those kids as well. So I think that's another group. The other group that I think is very important, and I really hope that we don't miss the bus on this, is the transition kids. A girl who was, let's say, in the 5th grade last March, she needs to take admission in the 7th grade, which means she's going to have to shift schools from a primary school to an upper primary school. It's gone from like 1 kilometer away to 5 or 3 kilometers away. Right? That's where we will lose the maximum number of children, and especially girls. And that's also the most vulnerable age because this is the age there will be the push for them to get married and to get pregnant. And so that's the whole other target group that we have to monitor, we have to measure, we have to track very, 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 very carefully. And these are also, and the secondary ones, let's say I was in class 7, am I going to come back into class 9? Those are really important. And then some, we have to identify the permanently at risk, your COVID orphans. Girls, let's say, who were in the 8th grade but now should get admission in the 10th, but they're not going to make it. They may not be able to be mainstreamed back. So you'll need to have a plan to bring them back via the alternate education system in some way or form. And I think to break it down plan for this, we'll really have to take everybody along. Your PRI members, your Sarpanch, your Anganwadi, your parents, your teachers, your entire system. And which is why I said, this has to become a success metric. How is each state doing? How is each district doing? How is each school and how is each village doing on this sort of piece? And then lastly, I think we'll have to bring all of our tools and, from our arsenal for this problem. We all know how to do bridge camps, residential, non-residential, KGBVs. We'll just have to leverage all of them to make sure that every single child that went out of school March, when the lockdown happened, is back and flourishing back in school. Thanks.
Thanks, Safina. I think this call to action of all children back in school is I think very, very powerful, and I think we shouldn't forget that as we go forward. And I'm going to come back to you in a second on something else after I speak to probably Sonali and Ashok, is around the emotional impact of all of this and how do we mitigate all of that. But I'm going to come back to you when we discuss about when schools open, how do we sort of re-engage these children. Sonali, Ashok, I'm going to come to you, and before I come to you, I'm going to read something aloud, which I read this morning. Some of you might have read a op-ed that Anurag Bihar, who is the CEO of the Azim Premji Foundation, has written in the Mint today. And it's a very interesting op-ed, but I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs. And he says, quote, education is in a state of emergency. So the real outrage is not open schools. It is not to open schools when that can be done safely. And then there is an even bigger outrage lurking in the background, the phenomenon of learning loss. Shockingly, few states seem worried about this massive educational deficit, and plans appear afoot to start schools as though it was only a minor break. Let us observe the enormity of over 200 million children having lost 16 months and more of their learning. We cannot ignore this and move on. Not only will it be hard for them to regain what they have lost, but much subsequent learning will be impossible. How can you learn in class 6 syllabus if you never learned class 5 syllabus and have forgotten what you learned in class 4 and 3? That was a long quote, but that kind of aptly summarizes. And if you look at some of the data coming out, including that from the Azim Premji Foundation, CSF just did a small pilot survey. We see massive learning losses, including almost half the children in grade 2 being non-readers. So let's start with Sonali. Sonali, you've been working a lot on the what I call the in-classroom component, and so does Ashok in a few of the states that Akshara works on. Sonali, is schooling going to remain the same, which means that the structure of school, suppose we solve the Safina problem that all children are back to school, and that's not a non-trivial problem, but suppose they get back to school, we restart schools. How is schooling going to look? Is it going to look the same? Is it going to look differently? Is remediation the answer? Is there a quick fix acceleration program? What does it look like? How do we structure curriculum? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, Anustub. Thank you, CSF, for inviting Nudge Foundation for inviting me on this conversation, which is so critical and something that we all, as people in the sector, all the stakeholders, should be aware of. And Anustub, you bring up a very important point that we are all wondering what's going to happen when schools open, whether it's this year or whether it's next year. And I hope that our answer to what you're saying is that we don't go back to what it was. The reason being, well, it was a broken system. The pandemic just enhanced or just brought out what was broken in a more solid way. And if that's really what we go back to, we are going to, we are never going to be covering these learning losses. We are never going to figure out how our foundational literacy numeracy will be achieved, or how learning will be achieved for children even in high grades. So first thing, no, we don't want to go back to where we were, and I hope that doesn't happen. The second question I think you asked me was, is remediation the answer? And what kind of solution can we think of? So I think there's a whole restructuring that we have to think of now. And we can't do band-aid solutions anymore. We can't do short-term solutions anymore. We have to restructure the entire way in which we're thinking of the curriculum, the way we think of delivering the curriculum in the classroom, and what are we dealing with really. I think in Anurag Bihar's article that there's an example of what he gives. Imagine if the child is in 6th standard, is now going to go in the 6th standard when they come back, hasn't done 7th standard, was already facing a learning loss when he was in 5th standard. Look at the lag that we're dealing with. We're dealing with a 3 to 5 year lag. And to say that remediation is going to take care of it at a short-term level is not really the answer to it. So the answer to it is rethinking the way our objectives are set, and rethinking the way we are delivering those objectives. Does it have to be very hard graded objectives? Can it be a learning spiral rather than grade objectives? Because with all the children, anyway, the reality is that they work across abilities. It's not no classroom will ever be at the same level. And to think, therefore, that all objectives will be achieved at the end of grade 2, grade 3, which is something we're very accustomed to thinking now, I think requires a rethink. The second thing that we need to look at is remediation. What is remediation? Remediation is when you've taught in the classroom, there's a gap, and then you cover that gap. When the children haven't learned and all, where is the question of remediation? What we're looking at is really bridging through an accelerated process. But the acceleration at the same time should not affect the foundational literacy numeracy skills, because that's priority for us. So prioritizing the foundational literacy numeracy outcome, no matter which grade the children are in. I think we lose this out, especially as we cross the third standard, fourth standard, and we say that, okay, let's just focus on the subject, let's just focus on the topics. But we have to remember, kids have forgotten how to read, kids have forgotten how to do math. We have to get them back to that level before we take them forward. And this is not a 1 year process. This is not a 3 month process. This is not even a 2 year process. This is a longer process. We have to think of this as a 3 to 5 year process that will continue to happen each year. So for us to be able to cover the lag that we have faced. So no short-term solutions. Think of it as a long-term, not remediation. Think of it as a long-term solution, which already incorporates all these elements, and prioritizing the outcomes is the most, to foundational literacy numeracy is the most critical, immediate decision that we all need to take.
No, thank you, Sonali, for warning us that this is not a very short-term fix. I think we need to hear it more and more. I think it's beginning to become very clear that a 3 month kind of or 6 month, whatever, worked in the past is not going to work. And I think thanks for clarifying that remediation is a word often used and misused in our ecosystem, right? You can remediate something if you have learned it in the first place. I want to bring in Ashok here. Ashok, I'm a great fan of the work you do across all the states. The other side of the coin, did we just lose Ashok? No. Yes. Ashok, the flip side of the student coin is the teacher, and I've heard you speak a lot about how you and also your team members are supporting teachers, and a beautiful concept that I read in an article recently about a dual lesson plan. So speak to us a little bit that in all of this, how do we support teachers to be equipped to deliver in the classroom better? And especially when a situation which our colleague and friend Saurabh Banerjee, who spoke very eloquently in the last panel, calls flip-flop, which is that the schools might open, they might again close because we don't know whether there's a third wave or a fourth wave or something else out there. And as much as I'm worried about children, I'm also equally worried about teachers. So tell us a little more about teachers. Of course, I'd love to hear your views on children as well. But let's start with teachers.
Thank you, Anustup. I think I'll go a little beyond teachers as well. Because I think it's important that we use this opportunity to come up with a problem-solving culture. I mean, we tend to speak a lot, but at the end of the day, we have to do things on the ground. Look at the first reactions to COVID-19 when many of the private schools and some budget private schools went online. Other than moving conventional classrooms online, there's been little or no innovation in teaching or learning. So it's just what I was doing in the classroom, goes online. I mean, that doesn't cut the, mustard, as they say, right? Over the last 16 months, I think Sonali and Safina both have said learning loss has been significant. But let me scare you with the number, right? If you take 250 million children and assign a notional loss of $100 per child, it becomes $25 billion, which is 175,000 crores, right? An entire government was pulled down on a notional loss called the 2G scam, right, for that kind of money. And here we are. I'm not advocating for any governments to be pulled down, but I'm saying society is not talking enough about this loss. This is a huge loss. Second, behavioral changes. Right? The internet is not the solution to everything. Children do need the guidance and the hand-holding of a teacher. So you can't just turn around and say, swap one for the other. It has to be a blended approach, right? And the third thing, I think, Anustup, you also said that third wave, fourth wave. I go by, the advice of a very well-known epidemiologist, Larry Brilliant, who solved the smallpox problem many years ago. And in his own words to an interview with MSNBC last week, he said, we are nowhere near the end of the pandemic, right? And the reason is very simple. With so many infections worldwide, you don't know how frequently things are going to mutate. So you have a Delta variant, and I think yesterday I read about another Greek alphabet variant that has just come in. So this thing, we will probably run short of Greek alphabets over the next 2-3 years, right? So we have to devise solutions that go completely post-COVID. I mean, it's not in reaction to what COVID did to us, but because of what COVID did to us, we have to ensure some kind of future-proofing of education for our children. So, with that perspective, at Akshara, what we did was we said, can we attempt a blended learning model? You know, you look at the NEP, it talks about foundational literacy and numeracy. It talks about community engagement. It talks about bringing in technology. So we said, here is a great chance to bring all of that together. Is can we bring it in? And if you look at our report that's available on our website on the alternate learning project, we did 2 small pilots where we said that the curriculum is broken up to be delivered in 2 different ways. One with the teacher, in a regular classroom, and one using energized textbooks, the Diksha platform, and content that's available on Diksha. And these are obviously all approved by state SERTs and so on. So the classroom is broken into 2, and we ensure that every child gets access to the teacher for half the week and access to technology for the other half of the week. So, I strongly feel that we would have come to things like this even if there was no COVID, because of the sheer digital divide that exists. And if you're talking equitable education, you can't have this inequity running so rampant in our system. I've heard numbers as low as 4%, and I think the high side I've heard is 30% for access to smartphones in rural India. I'd go with the middle ground and say 20%. But that means 80% of our children are disadvantaged, even in something like this. What is the cost? We reckon the cost would be 2,000 rupees per child per year. So in a state like Karnataka, where let's say you have 5 million kids, I'm just using that becomes 1,000 crores. You multiply a state like Karnataka by 30 times to cover small states, big states in India. That's 30,000 crores. Say I'm wrong, it becomes 50,000 crores. What's 50,000 crores when you're talking about a loss of 175,000 crores? Right? That investment helps you keep the education going. It helps you ensure that there is no digital divide. Children are learning. I think this is the kind of problem solving we need to get into and do this in a big way.
No, thanks, Ashok, for scaring us with those numbers, because sometimes quantifying a number in a way people understand, in a way people can relate to is important. I just wanted to also use this opportunity to bring Madhukar. Madhukar, you've been listening to a number of conversations like this, including this one, right? I mean, you've got Sonali talking about restructured curriculum. You've got Ashok talking about blended mode of learning. You've got Safina talking about access. And you work very closely with the government, and interestingly at all levels of the government. And that's one of the things I'm particularly impressed by the work that LFE does. So tell me a little bit about what do you think are the ways in which the government response can be structured so that we actually deliver on these promises? Because let truth be said that many of these ideas are actually spoken about in many forums. This is not the first time we are hearing them. So what's your take? How do we ensure these actually land on the ground, reach the last mile? And what's also your take on how do we engage all parts of the government? Because sometimes when you use the word government, we oftentimes think of it as a monolith, and it is anything but that.
No, thanks, Anustoop and CSF Nudge Foundation for having me. Really good to listen to Sonali, Safina, and Ashok talk about their observations. One of the key sayings whenever you go on the ground, and then in Maharashtra, when you go and say how's it going, how the program's going, the often response is ki chan vyavasthit chalu hai, sab vyavasthit. Everyone says like it's going on good. Then you add a question, what does good mean? And the first, like no one has really, like you don't get into the depth of how do you leverage number certain observations to actually see. So I think to answer your question in simple way, some of the things we are learning from the ground is how do you really leverage data monitoring sort of systems to be able to inform everyone, right, from teachers, the middle management that I think LFE works very strongly and closely with, and even your top level policymakers, right? And it's not just to inform instruction, but I think even as non-profit organizations, I think we leverage data in all forms, right? Let it be in terms of how many. I mean, Ashok had great examples. Even Safina shared about some of the numbers, because these are the numbers that actually rile up both non-profit organizations. But how do you ensure that some of this data monitoring sort of structures also help governance and decision making? Because we are doing things, even in the state of Maharashtra, there are 15 sort of initiatives that have been launched for COVID response in education, right? But if you suddenly get into, okay, fine, this is a TV initiative, what has been the viewership? How many what are the TRP ratings? Do we have an integrated sort of a dashboard that integrates Diksha, the television, the radio programs? And I think all of this combined, I think even if it reaches 30%, 40, 50% of the children who are getting, say, printed material, what is the reach that has been done? If not reached, can you go a level below? How many of them have again, resubmitted their worksheets and you've given them again? How many teachers are going? So it's missing right now. It's even frustrating because yesterday, and I'm talking about a live situation right now. Yesterday, the government released a resolution saying 17th August, सारे schools खोल रहे पूरे महाराष्ट्र में. Yesterday at 10:30 p.m., they revoked it. Why? Because the COVID task force in Maharashtra felt that they do not have enough data on children getting COVID or not getting COVID. Now, we have the data. There's numerous sort of researches that have been done. At 10:30 in the night, again, if there's political will, politicians really want to do it. The CM office, the education minister, the department are all behind it. The educators are behind it. We have done a lot of massive, but because of a lack of data, it's safe to not open schools was a decision that was made at 10:30. Now, you see what I'm talking about. Like, how do you really... There's, Peter Senjay has this take about assumption of the illusion of broken systems. All of us outside the system always feel that the system is broken, but whereas people inside the system always think that it is delivering the kind of result that the system is supposed to deliver. It's exactly mirroring what you when you think of systems change. People, even though you want it, but there's an element that we don't have enough data to be able to not open schools. Is perhaps the most silly argument that when everyone was ready, the schools are ready. In fact, in the panel also we spoke to the children. Children were ready to get back to school. Teachers are ready. 81%. Talking about data, SCRT launched a survey. 81% of the parents themselves want to send the children in Maharashtra. When you have all of this, but there's still some element that our health fraternity doesn't agree to. But whatever, I think what I'm trying to say is data and monitoring is perhaps one of the key things to mobilize people at different levels. We are seeing a lot of activity both at the Gram Panchayat Sarpanch level. But I think the key in this, and the topic is school education post-COVID. I really don't think there's going to be a post-COVID. I think there will be COVID. We need to ensure how do you sort of live with it and ensure we're supporting children throughout. But in my opinion, how do you sort of have an integrated approach of data that is informing governance and decision making at different levels, right, from a teacher to like policymakers, and to be able to sort of support our children better. So that for me, I think is going to be the key thing going forward.
Thank you, Madhukar. I'm going to bring in the audience questions here. I urge the audience to put in your questions on the Q&A chat box so that we can pick them up and address it to the panelists. There's a very interesting question which says, if we are to focus, and this is from Vaishnavi, if we are to focus on different modes of delivery, then should for the next few years the end goal also shift and change? For example, moving the focus away from their current systems of boards, exams, have a new long-term overhaul of the end goal to complement. Ashok, you hinted that we might have just superposed the existing ways of working onto a new mode. Would you like to take a shot at this? And perhaps I could bring in someone else, maybe Sunagi or...
Yeah. So I think, sometimes we have very simplistic answers. I mean, one answer has been we waive school exams and change evaluation criteria. To me, that's a cop-out, right? We need to do much, much better than, just doing that. So I think that if you really want to be future-proof, because I think like Madhukar also said, there will be waves and waves of this kind of disruptions. I think you cannot afford to have children hanging by a thread that kind of is very, very flimsy. So this is an opportunity for us to rethink our system completely and bring in the elements of the national education policy. I'm not saying bring in something new. The NEP says FLN, the NEP says community engagement, the NEP says technology. Bring in all of this creatively. I'm not saying the Akshara solution is the only one, but the Akshara solution is out there. We have tested some things out of it, and it seems to work. Right? And I'm sure there are many more creative minds in this country that can come up with other things. I mean, this is we are one of the largest startup nations in the world. So can we put the collective might of all of that, but come up with multiple things? These are going to require huge systemic changes. I mean, I think teacher mindsets have to be changed drastically. Now, it's going to be both painful and fun for the teacher. Painful because they have to change, but fun because this is a great way of actually delivering education. I mean, this is how we got to position this whole thing well. All the solutions that we did at Akshara, we thought what's in it for each of the following groups: the government, for the pedagogy, for the teachers, for the monitoring, for the assessment, and for the community. So if you can answer what's in it for me for each of these groups, I think you have solutions that will make a difference. And it will make a difference in a positive way. I'm bullish about what can happen, but we need the collective might of all of us.
No, thank you for saying that you're feeling bullish in spite of all these setbacks. Sonali, there's a great question from Shivangi, also builds on something that Ashok hinted at. We're seeing a massive learning loss, she asks. How do we see assessments changing in this scenario? How can we bring in assessments in the form of pretest to assess where children are? How can we go ahead? Any thoughts on that?
So I'm just going to touch upon the earlier question and then move ahead to this one. I think more than thinking of, when we think of the end goal, it's not about what children learn, but it should be about how children are learning. Right? If our end goal becomes that a child can learn on their own, children can learn on their own. If we form or if we develop curriculum, if we develop pedagogy in a way that children are able to accomplish their own learning goals, and this is of course a period that it's something that you do over a period of time. But if the how of that is solved, then we don't have to worry about the what of the learning, because then children will learn how to do this on their own. So the goal shift has to be from the what to the how. That's the first thing. The second thing you spoke about is assessments, right? I think assessments need to be very relevant to what the child is learning in a way that's relevant for themselves. Again, is learning relevant? Children are not going to come back to school today, especially adolescent children, if it's not relevant to them at all. So therefore, the assessments has to be more in relation to how is this relevant in my life? How is this going to help me in my life ahead? Whether it is to learn math to do financial planning as I move ahead, or whether it is to learn literature so that I can understand, I can write a book if I want to. Right? So it's about those higher learning order skills, and I know there is a whole question around the higher learning order skills, and higher learning order skills are looked at competitive exam skills, unfortunately, but that's not the truth. High order is when a child can learn on their own, can understand where they are in relation to their own learning, and the assessments therefore being relevant to that context.
No, thank you so much, because assessments are often used and misused in different contexts, but if they're used in the right way, I think they can lead us in the right direction. And
can I add a little bit?
Please do.
So, the thing is, if every child has digital access for half the week, for example, we talked about this comprehensive and continuous evaluation for the longest time, right? Now, if the child has access to a digital device, you could actually do this in a fairly interesting manner with assessments flowing in, so the child each child does it on the device, and you have interesting back-end data coming back into the system to say how can you improve the learning outcomes. So when you give the child digital access, you also open the channel for getting assessments flowing continuously during the course of the year. So that's another benefit that I can see.
Absolutely. And it's contingent upon that big if, right? And that's a great question. I was again going to direct it to you. Aniruddha is asking, we know today about the lack of access to connectivity and devices. Should there be a discourse and discussion on how this can possibly become available? And this is in the context of also large systems, right, Ashok? When we go to a government and we talk about access, when you're on the other side, you're somebody who's going to actually make these devices available. I think a lot of people agree, even on the side of the government, that yes, we should increase access. But the question is, what's a feasible and a viable way to increase access? Do you have some thoughts?
Okay, so I think when you say access, you mean access to digital devices.
Digital devices, yes, yes. Right now we're talking about access to digital.
Yeah. So I'm saying there are so many assets around us that we don't leverage. Okay. Number one is Diksha is not leveraged enough. It's a population scale platform that's available. I think we need to use it more and more and more, right? I know that as of about a month ago, there were 2,300 crore sessions on Diksha. But, don't forget, we have 300 million children. So, 2,300 crores is really not that big a number, right? I think it has to grow. Number two, I think, is that we may not have it today, but there is definitely a plan of the government to have fiber optic connectivity at the Gram Panchayat level. So when that happens, you could have hotspots and then Wi-Fi, in the neighborhood there. So, schools can have access to some form of network, not necessarily all the time, but you can. So I think all these assets need to be leveraged, and we have to see what to do. I think the larger question is going to be, what about devices and who's going to provide for it, right? When we did our pilot, remember I said it costs 2,000 rupees per child per year. I mean, that was simply on the assumption that, let's say, if Anustup is the head of an SHG in the middle of wherever you are, and you're servicing, 250 kids, you can create 2 or 3 part-time jobs, paying 1,500 to 1,700 rupees a month. And that role of that SHG would be just to collect the devices, recharge and service them every day, and swap between 2 groups of children, right? And I'm sure there will be enough impact investors who would be willing to fund that SHG to make that happen. 5-6 lakhs. And if the state is guaranteeing 2,000 rupees per child per year, it pays for all of that and 3 livelihoods. So you not only keep education running, you create some amount of little livelihoods going as well. So there is all these possibilities. So financial engineering, I think there's a lot of scope and for innovation out there as well.
No, thanks. I'll move to Safina, as I promised, on socio-emotional learning. And while I move to Safina, I want you all to think about one key message you want to send out to the decision makers in government. I'll come back to all of you after I hear back from Safina. One key message that you want to leave the government decision maker with that they can act on. Safina, tell me a little bit about this whole issue of how do we ease children back into school. This morning, this afternoon, when we were listening to these children, they spoke of really big things that have happened in their lives. A child spoke about losing her father, another spoke about losing her father, losing the job. There's a lot of stress at home, disconnection from a familiar environment. What are some pragmatic steps that you would recommend to ease children back to school?
Yeah, no, I think what our children are going through is really immense, and for that, just like I had given the answer for access to say, the first and most important metric will be that all kids get into school. I would say my second and most important metric after the first one needs to be that all kids want to go to school every day. Okay, so I'm going to say the hawa and the scaring of the learning loss, please keep it in the cupboard for a little while. Okay, because I think it's going to be very difficult, because all this, I know that, Anurag, I have great respect for him, and Sonali is my deep friend, but I would still say keep the conversation of learning loss a little bit controlled, because आपका टेंशन बच्चे के ऊपर जाएगा. टीचर और हम सब इतने रश में हो जाएंगे कि बस भैया जल्दी जल्दी उसका लर्निंग लॉस कंप्लीट करो. अब वो ऐसे ही घबराया हुआ आया है. I have a child, Nitin, who lives in a hut where you have to bend down below your waist to be able to enter his hut. Okay. His mother, who is now working as labor on a construction site in Bangalore, hundreds of miles away from her hut. He has been picked up by his mamas and he's working in a coal mine. 10-year-old boy. Now this year he's going to be 12 years old. When he comes back into school, he has gone through a whole life journey in that year and a half, right? And do not open up your agenda of learning loss with him putting that pressure on his head. So my submission would be, your second metric, please, has got to be about that every day I want Nitin, when he comes back into school, when you have enrolled him, is that he feels real joy going into school. Every single child wakes up and they're happy to go back into school. Do not make it a place of, this rushing into his, closing his gaps and all the rest of it. Yes, those have to be done, but give a school readiness time. Give that pause period. My chuntu puntus who are in my camp, okay, they'll be in class 2, but they don't even know how to hold a pencil. आप सीधा फाउंडेशन लिटरेसी पे मत जाओ उनके साथ, थोड़ा सा थाम लो अपने आप को. Okay. Great. So, and the more we scare the state and the more we scare the system about this, the more pressure will come on the children. And what we really want is, like I said, the metric saying that boy needs to wake up and he needs to be excited कि यार I'm back in school. कितना मजा आएगा. And if we create that glue, children are not used to sitting down and paying attention for that long. A lot of the younger kids don't even know how to hold a pencil. I remember I was calling Sonali, like she's on my speed dial. So like, Sonali, I have these little kids in my camp and I'm doing ABCD for 6 weeks now and wo ja hi nahi raha andar. And she said, listen, you're stupid. They need a school readiness curriculum before they're even ready to learn. And I think to Sonali, and she showed me this wonderful material. And immediately I was like, oh my God, with them I have to start with the standing line, sleeping line, and way below where I would naturally. And she guided me and I realized that a lot more of our children will need that. So I would just say, everybody pause. I know it's worrying you, but just take a little bit of a pause around this. And because Nitin and children like him are no longer your captive audience. He has worked in a coal mine. He has earned his own money. आप ज्यादा परेशान करोगे ना उसको, तो उसको पता है यार मैं पैसे कमा लूंगा 4, मैं क्यों इनकी इतनी बुरी बातें सुनूं. Yeah, they are not your captive audience unless you create and you change that mindset to saying, I need my Nitin to be so happy to walk into a school every day. You're going to lose it. And that, I think, is the SEL. That's the core and the heart of the emotional, the social, what Sonali was saying, the relevancy. And I think after bringing them back into school, that needs to take precedence before the academic, the competencies, the skills, the learning outcomes, and everything else that we want him to really do. Secondly, I do want to make a point, and I think while everybody is thinking digital and technology, I work in gender, I work with some of the most poorest children. I want to flag this, that please be careful as you're designing technology and digital solution. The biggest risk I see to inclusion and equity and gender is at tech. Okay, if we don't, Facebook was created very nice. It'll be like social connection and all that, but it's breaking democracies. And the same will be, there's a lot of investment going into edtech, but it's going to leave our poorest behind, and the gap is just going to be so wide, we may not be able to cover it in 100 years. That's the risk we see. So anybody who's working on that, just be really, really, really careful in how you're designing. Make sure you're not designing anything in the digital and the edtech space without an equity and an inclusion lens, because that is truly the biggest fear that I have of where this world and where education will land up. So
hear you loud and clear. So do I take it all children back in school and want to go back to school as your one line? If I'm not putting words into your mouth, what is
all kids? All kids back in school, and all kids enjoy school and want to go to school.
Enjoy school and want to go to school. So what's your line, ending line, Madhukar, for all of us who are involved in schools?
I think lovely. Just following Sapina would be hard, but I think for me, I think it's just going to be just leveraging the local leadership. I think there is a lot of merit in working along with sarpanches, gram panchayats, people who have a lot of wisdom on the ground. There is great thing to work with policymakers, but how do you leverage the people on the ground, and in especially in government structures, how do you leverage the middle management, especially the block and cluster level people? No innovation that I can think of in education has ever sustained without these people being on board. So I think leveraging these people so that the panchayat sarpanches, they themselves sort of lead, because it's no more an issue of policy. It's a community issue now. I think to all the points that have been said by panelists. So how do you make this a community issue of reopening schools, ensuring children are back, ensuring that they're learning, not just learning, but also on their working on their well-being. So I feel that is like the biggest thing for us to do from my end. Yeah.
Sonali.
Think of the last child in that class. Think of the most vulnerable. Think of that last child in that class before you build any solution. Your solution should not be at the top, it should be at the bottom of the pyramid. That's really my last and only focus that all of us should have as we're rebuilding.
And Ashok, what would be your message?
Mine would be I think we need a very strong vision. So we need a vision of a systemic change at population scale so that we can future-proof education for our children. So that's the one line, answer. And I go back for inspiration to what Aadhaar did for people in a large way. I mean, today you can transfer money to your sabziwala on the street cart just by doing Paytm, and so there is the Aadhaar database that kind of made that happen. So that thinking of saying we can collectively throw out solutions that can reach every last child, and it, like Sonali said, it has to be designed for the last child. Then it will work for the top child as well. So the last child is where your focus should be.
Thank you. I'll end with you, Shavita. I started with you, and what are your thoughts after hearing all of us?
Hard to add after hearing everything that's been so passionately presented and discussed, but I'll end with what I'd started with. This is an opportunity for us to learn that band-aid solutions don't work, and there is a reason they don't work. Please give the impact of children not coming to school for a year and a half. Like Safina highlighted, we don't even know where these kids are now, right? They are actually, they are having to earn a livelihood under duress. Give COVID its due respect. Let's not come under any political or bureaucratic pressure, with all due regards, to declare victory. Look at how resilient and strong we are. We got the kids back and everyone's back to, where they needed to be. There is enough research which shows that we need more than, like for a grade 3 kid, the learning loss that she has already faced can only be corrected by the time she reaches grade 10, if we do everything correct, right? So take a more forward-looking strategy to say that this will take a few years. If we have to, irrespective of which class the child is sitting in, don't go by the grade of the classroom, but the learning level of the child. Give it its due. Don't be in a rush to declare victory over COVID. Don't go for band-aid solutions. It has exposed fundamental weaknesses in the system. How do we correct for that?
Thank you, everyone, and especially the audience who's joined in large numbers listening to us. Thank you for those wonderful questions. Thank you, panelists, for those very insightful suggestions and really coming from the heart. And I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't say that when I entered this conversation, I entered with a heavy heart and a heavy mind, always thinking how hard it would be to solve this crisis. But I can say that I'm leaving with a lot more hope and optimism, however, cautious hope and cautious optimism. And like Sapina said, let's ensure that all children are back in school. They want to go back to school. They're happy. As Shavita said, let's not fix any band-aid solutions. And Ashok and Madhukar have been talking about, let's have a vision that is both forward-thinking at one end, that we are really rebuilding back better, and we're not just kind of drag and drop or click and drag the existing solutions. and let's involve everybody. Let's carry everyone along. Let's not make this the task of a few. And my favorite one is always think of the last child and always think of the teacher. Thank you very much, and we look forward to having the next panel. Please stay on, and we learned a lot. Thank you again.
Thank you.